Homelander is supposed to be untouchable. Bullets bounce off him. Bombs barely slow him down. The show treats him as the strongest thing walking the earth. Then, somewhere across the multiverse, a drunk old man built a gun that opens doors between worlds. In this video, we put that title on trial and ask one question. Could Rick Sanchez destroy the boys' universe? Setting the ground rules. Before any punch gets thrown or any laser beam gets fired, a fight between two shows that were never built to touch each other needs a fair starting point. Rick and Morty comes from Adult Swim and follows a genius scientist named Rick Sanchez and his grandson Morty as they travel across countless worlds and timelines. The Boys comes from Amazon and follows a small group of regular people trying to take down a corporation that manufactures superheroes for profit. One show is loud, cartoonish, and built on jokes about science fiction. The other show is grim, grounded, and built on jokes about corporate greed and fame. Putting these two worlds side by side is not something either show ever planned for. So the first job here is building a fair floor to stand on before anything else gets discussed. Rick and Morty takes place across what the show calls a multiverse. This means there are countless versions of Earth, countless versions of every character, and countless versions of Rick himself scattered through different dimensions. Some of these Ricks are geniuses, some are failures, some are dead. The show has built entire episodes around this idea, including a location called the Citadel of Ricks, where thousands of alternate Ricks and Mortys from different dimensions live together in one massive city. This detail matters a lot for this discussion, because it means the version of Rick being talked about needs to be named clearly. Not every Rick is equally dangerous, and lumping them all together would make any comparison meaningless. The Rick being used for this discussion is the main Rick shown across the television series, most often labeled Rick C-137 in early seasons, before later revealed to be a different designation tied to his backstory. This is the same Rick who lives with his daughter Beth, her husband Jerry, and his grandchildren Morty and Summer. This is the Rick who built the portal gun, invented countless devices across the run of the show, and has been shown time and again making choices that affect entire timelines. Sticking to this single version of Rick keeps things fair and keeps the comparison grounded in what the show has actually put on screen, rather than picking and choosing the strongest possible alternate Rick to win an argument. The Boys does not work the same way. There is no multiverse here, no alternate timelines, no other versions of Homelander running around in a parallel dimension. Everything happens on one single version of Earth, one that looks almost exactly like the real world, except for one major difference. In this world, a company called Vought International discovered a way to give people superpowers using something called Compound V. Vought turned superheroes into a business. They have a top team of heroes called the Seven. They sell merchandise, they run movie studios, and they control public opinion through media the same way a real entertainment company might. The heroes in this world are not born with their powers. They are given them, usually as babies, by a company chasing profit. This difference in structure changes what destroying a universe would even mean for each show. In Rick and Morty, destroying a universe or a timeline has happened on screen more than once, and the show treats it as something that is technically possible with the right tools, even if it comes with consequences. In The Boys, there is only one Earth to destroy, and there is no science fiction device sitting around that could erase it from existence. Any threat to that world would have to come from an outside force, bringing something new into a setting that otherwise runs on human technology, corporate power, and biology. This is one of the biggest gaps between the two shows, and it needs to be named clearly before anything else gets compared. Tone is the next major difference, and it shapes how each show treats power itself. Rick and Morty plays enormous, universe-ending events for laughs just as often as it plays them for drama. A planet getting destroyed might be treated with the same energy as a joke about paperwork. Characters shrug off events that would be treated as catastrophic tragedies in almost any other show. This means that when something is described as universe-threatening in Rick and Morty, it needs to be checked against what actually happened on screen, not just against the tone the characters used while talking about it. Rick himself downplays serious events constantly, which makes it easy to either overstate or understate what he is actually capable of if only his own words are trusted. The Boys takes the opposite approach. Nothing in that show is played as a joke when someone dies. A death in The Boys usually comes with blood, screaming, and consequences that ripple through the story for multiple episodes. When a character in that world is described as capable of leveling a city, that description tends to be backed up by an actual scene showing exactly what that looks like. The show wants its violence to feel real and lasting, not tossed aside a few minutes later. This means that power in The Boys is generally easier to measure directly, because the show rarely rarely hides how strong something is behind a joke or a shrug. Putting these two approaches together creates an interesting problem. Rick and Morty often understates its own power level through humor, while The Boys usually shows its power level directly and lets it sit with weight. A fair comparison has to account for this, instead of assuming that a joke made about a universe-ending event in Rick and Morty means the event was somehow smaller or less serious than it actually was. The show has had side characters and even background writers describe Rick as capable of destroying more than a single planet, and those claims need to be treated with the same seriousness as anything shown directly in The Boys, even if Rick himself brushes it off with a sarcastic comment 2 seconds later. Another piece of groundwork involves timing. Both shows have run for multiple seasons, and characters change a lot over time. Homelander, in the first season of The Boys, is a very different character from Homelander several seasons later, after he loses restraint, gains new versions of the serum, and becomes far more willing to use his full power in public. Rick also changes across his show, gaining new inventions, going through new personal arcs, and sometimes losing access to gear he had in earlier seasons. For a comparison to make sense, the version of each character needs to reflect where they stand after the most recent events confirmed in their shows, not an early season version who might be weaker or working with less information. This matters even more because both shows are still airing new material. The Boys has introduced newer and more dangerous versions of its core serum in later seasons, giving certain characters power boosts beyond what earlier seasons established. Rick and Morty has continued introducing new gadgets, new backstory details about Rick's past, and new explanations for how far his abilities really go. Locking onto the most recently confirmed version of each character, based on what has actually aired, keeps this discussion honest instead of freezing both shows at an earlier and less accurate point in their stories. There is also the question of what team each side brings along. Rick almost never fights alone. He has Morty with him most of the time, and depending on the situation, other family members or allies from his world might get involved, along with a wide range of tools, weapons, and vehicles he has built or collected. The Boys works the same way on its side. Homelander does not exist in isolation either. He leads the Seven, a team of other superpowered people. And beyond that, Vought has produced other extremely dangerous individuals throughout the show, including some who received early and unstable versions of the serum that gave them power on a similar scale to Homelander himself. Deciding whether this is a one-on-one matchup between Rick and Homelander, or a wider clash between everything Rick can bring and everything the Boys universe can throw back, changes the entire shape of the discussion. A single genius with a portal gun facing one superpowered man is a very different question from that same genius facing an entire corporation with dozens of superpowered employees, government contracts, and decades of experimental weapons research sitting in vaults. Both versions of this question are worth asking, and later sections will look at each layer separately instead of mashing them together into one vague and confusing scenario. Sourcing is the last major ground rule, and it might be the most important one. Everything used to describe Rick's abilities in this discussion comes from what has actually aired in Rick and Morty, along with direct statements made by the people who write and produce the show when discussing his abilities publicly. Everything used to describe Homelander and the wider cast of The Boys comes from what has actually aired in that show, along with direct statements from its writers and producers when they have spoken about the rules of their own universe. Fan theories, fan-made power rankings, and guesses about what a character could theoretically do if pushed further are being left out entirely. If a claim cannot be tied back to something that was actually shown or actually said by the people who make these shows, it does not belong in this discussion. This approach might seem strict, but it exists for a good reason. Comparisons like this one tend to fall apart the moment someone starts stretching a character's abilities past what their show has actually confirmed. It becomes very easy to say a character could theoretically do almost anything once actual evidence gets replaced with speculation. Staying locked to confirmed material keeps both sides honest and keeps the entire discussion grounded in something real, even though the matchup itself is completely made up and never happened in either show. With all of that laid out, the shape of this discussion becomes much clearer. This is not going to be a simple guess based on vibes or based on which show feels cooler on a surface level. This is going to walk through Rick's actual confirmed abilities, walk through Homelander and the wider cast of The Boys' actual confirmed abilities. Look at what tools and weapons each side could bring into a fight. Look at how tough it has actually been shown to kill the strongest characters on The Boys' side. And then finally, look at something that matters just as much as raw power. That final piece is whether Rick, given his personality, his laziness, and his complicated relationship relationship with caring about anyone outside his own family, would ever have a reason to get involved with this world at all. That last point deserves a little more attention here at the start, because it shapes everything that follows. Raw power only matters if a character is willing to use it. Rick has walked away from fights he could have easily won. He has ignored threats to entire planets that were not his own. He has shown, again and again, that his motivation almost never lines up with saving strangers he has no connection to. A show like The Boys is packed with strangers, corporate villains, and a whole society built around people Rick has never met and has no reason to care about. Whether he would bother stepping into that world at all is a real question, separate from whether he technically could. This groundwork sets up the rest of the discussion cleanly. The next section moves directly into Rick's side of the equation, breaking down exactly what he has been shown doing across his own series, without any comparison yet to the Boys universe. Getting a full and accurate picture of Rick's real abilities first, before bringing Homelander or Vought into the conversation, makes every later comparison easier to follow and much harder to argue with. There is one more small piece worth mentioning before moving forward, and it involves scale versus detail. Rick and Morty tends to operate on an enormous scale, dealing with planets, dimensions, and timelines as normal parts of an average episode. The Boys tends to operate on a much smaller and more personal scale, focusing on a handful of people, a handful of city blocks, and consequences that hit individual characters directly. Comparing enormous scale against personal scale requires care, because a show built around city-level stakes is not automatically weaker than a show built around universe-level stakes. It simply tells its stories using a smaller camera. Keeping that distinction in mind avoids an easy trap where one show gets dismissed too quickly just because its normal stakes look smaller on paper. Both shows also share one surprising similarity buried underneath all of these differences. Each show is deeply interested in what happens when someone with enormous power also has serious personal problems. Rick drinks constantly, struggles with depression, and has been shown multiple times treating his own life and the lives of others around him with a shocking amount of carelessness. Homelander was raised inside a lab with no real parents, was taught from childhood that he was better than everyone around him, and has been shown struggling with a desperate need for approval that drives many of his worst decisions. Neither show is really about power for its own sake. Both shows use power as a way to explore broken people making bad choices, and that shared idea will matter later when this discussion gets into motivation instead of just raw strength. Keeping all of this in mind, the ground rules for this entire discussion can be summed up clearly. The version of Rick being used is the mainline Rick from the ongoing series, based on everything confirmed through the most recent seasons. The version of Homelander in the wider Boys universe being used is based on everything confirmed through the most recent seasons of that show as well. Claims will be backed only by what actually aired or by direct statements from the people who make these shows. Scale differences between an enormous science fiction multiverse and a grounded single Earth setting will be treated fairly, rather than assuming bigger automatically means stronger. And personality, not just raw power, will get real weight by the end of this discussion, because a character who is unstoppable on paper does not mean much if that character would never bother showing up in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With the floor built and the rules set, the next step is diving straight into Rick himself. What exactly has he been shown doing across his own show? What kind of science has he built? What kind of events has he caused? And what have the people behind the show said about the true scale of what he is capable of when he actually decides to try? That answer is not as simple as it might seem, and it opens the door to just how far this discussion is about to go. Section 2. Who is Rick Sanchez? The Canon Power Scale. Rick Sanchez is introduced from the very first episode of the show as a scientist who thinks on a level no other character can match. Before looking at any specific invention or event, it helps to understand how the show frames him from the start. He is Morty's grandfather. He moves in with his daughter Beth's family, and almost immediately he begins pulling Morty into dangerous situations involving science that no one else in the family understands. This sets the tone for the entire series. Rick is never treated as just a smart old man tinkering in a garage. He is treated as someone who can build machines that other characters, including trained scientists from other worlds, cannot even fully understand when they see them. The most famous piece of technology tied to Rick is the portal gun. This device allows him to open a doorway between different places at will. In the earliest episodes, this mostly looks like Rick opening a portal to another planet to grab an ingredient or escape a dangerous situation. As the show continues, it becomes clear that the portal gun does much more than that. It allows travel between entirely different dimensions, meaning entire separate versions of reality where different choices were made and different outcomes happened. A portal is not just a shortcut across space. It is a doorway that can cross into a version of existence where Rick made different life choices, where Earth turned out differently, or where he never existed at all. Very few pieces of technology introduced on any other show carry that kind of weight, and the portal gun is treated by the show as something Rick built himself, using knowledge that most other scientists in the show's universe do not have. This detail becomes extremely important once the show reveals more about how many versions of Earth and how many versions of Rick actually exist. The show introduces a massive hidden location called the Citadel of Ricks. This is a city built and run entirely by alternate versions of Rick and Morty from countless different dimensions. Thousands of Ricks live there, along with thousands of Mortys, each one coming from a slightly different version of reality where events played out differently. Some of these Ricks are considered failures by the Citadel's own internal ranking system. Others are considered dangerous enough to be tracked and monitored. The existence of this entire hidden society, built by countless versions of one single character, shows just how seriously the show treats the idea of alternate realities. It is not a side joke brought up once and dropped. It becomes a major, ongoing part of the show's structure, with entire episodes taking place inside the Citadel, and entire storylines built around conflicts between different Ricks. Rick himself is described within this system using a specific label. He refers to himself as the Rickest Rick, meaning that out of every alternate version of himself across every dimension, he considers himself the most capable, the smartest, and the least willing to compromise his own values or personality to fit in with any group. This claim is backed up by the show multiple times. When alternate Ricks try to recruit him into organized groups, he generally refuses, mocks their attempts at structure, and continues operating independently. Other Ricks within the Citadel treat him with a level of caution and respect that is not extended to random background Ricks who blend into the crowd. This detail matters because it establishes that among an enormous population of geniuses who are all technically the same person from different timelines, Rick still stands out as unusually capable, even by the standards of his own alternate selves. One of the clearest examples of just how far Rick's science goes comes from an early season episode where his car breaks down and needs a new power source. Instead of doing anything close to normal car repair, Rick builds an entire miniature universe and places it inside his car's battery. This tiny universe contains its own planet, its own civilization, and its own inhabitants who are completely unaware that their entire world exists only to generate power for a vehicle in a much larger universe above them. This miniature universe operates on its own rules of time, meaning that while barely any time passes for Rick and Morty in the main story, entire generations of people are born, grow old, and die inside the battery universe below them. At one point, the inhabitants inside this tiny universe even build their own smaller universe underneath their own civilization, creating a universe inside a universe inside a universe, each one powering the level above it. This entire chain collapses when Rick eventually destroys the outer layer of this structure, wiping out every civilization contained within it in an instant, simply because he no longer needs the power source anymore. This event is often treated by fans and by people who study the show closely as one of Rick's most extreme and clearly documented acts. It shows that Rick is capable of creating entire self-contained universes using tools he built himself, and it shows that he is willing to destroy those universes without much hesitation once they no longer serve a purpose to him. This is not treated by the show as some kind of accident or unintended side effect. Rick builds this power source on purpose, uses it for exactly what he intended, and disposes of it once it stops being useful, fully aware that entire civilizations were living inside it. Few pieces of evidence make Rick's raw capability and his complete lack of concern for the consequences of that capability more obvious than this single event. Beyond building entire universes, Rick has demonstrated a wide range of scientific abilities across many other episodes that further build out his reputation. He has created cloning technology capable of producing exact copies of people, including copies of himself and copies of members of his own family, in situations where the original might be in danger or might need to be somewhere else at the same time. This cloning technology is advanced enough that clones can pass as the real person without other family members noticing, at least for a while. He has also developed memory manipulation devices capable of erasing or altering specific memories in another person's mind, used at different points to remove painful experiences or to cover up events that Rick does not want want certain family members to remember. These are not one-time gadgets built for a single joke and never mentioned again. Memory manipulation and cloning both appear more than once across different seasons, showing that these are established parts of what Rick is capable of building whenever he decides the situation calls for it. Rick's reputation as a scientist extends beyond just his own family, and beyond just Earth. Across the show, other governments, other species, and other organizations are shown either fearing him, hunting him, or desperately trying to recruit him because of what he knows. One major storyline involves a massive organization called the Galactic Federation, which operates across many planets and holds enormous political and military power throughout much of known space. This organization becomes directly involved in trying to track down and capture Rick specifically, treating him as enough of a threat or enough of a valuable resource to dedicate massive amounts of effort toward finding him. An organization powerful enough to have influence across countless planets, choosing to focus specifically on one individual scientist, says a great deal about how seriously his abilities are taken within the show's own universe. This is not a minor local government worried about a neighborhood troublemaker. This is one of the largest and most powerful organizations shown across the entire series, treating Rick as a priority target. Weapons and combat capability make up another major piece of Rick's overall profile, separate from his larger-scale universe-building feats. Across many episodes, Rick is shown carrying and using a wide range of ray guns, laser weapons, and other devices capable of causing serious damage to individual targets. He has built weapons capable of disintegrating objects and people instantly. He has built weapons capable of shrinking or growing targets to extreme sizes. He has built defensive shields and personal protection devices capable of blocking incoming attacks that would otherwise be lethal to an ordinary person. None of these individual weapons are treated as particularly special within the context of the show, since Rick treats his own inventions with the same casual attitude he treats almost everything else in his life. But taken together, this steady stream of advanced personal weaponry shows that Rick does not rely purely on universe-scale science when a fight actually needs to happen. He has plenty of smaller, faster, and more direct tools built specifically for combat situations against individual threats. Rick's ship deserves separate attention here as well, since it plays a major role across many seasons of the show. This is not a simple vehicle used only for basic transportation. The ship is shown capable of traveling through space, surviving direct combat with other advanced spacecraft, and carrying a wide range of built-in weapons and defensive systems. In later seasons, the ship is revealed to have its own onboard intelligence, capable of communicating and interacting independently, adding another layer to how advanced Rick's personal technology has become over time. A ship this capable, built and maintained by one individual working largely alone, adds further weight to the idea that Rick's resources go far beyond what a normal human scientist would ever be expected to produce. Perhaps the single most important storyline for understanding the true scale of what Rick is capable of comes from a major arc that runs across multiple seasons involving a character known as Rick Prime. This storyline reveals that years before the events shown in the main series, Rick had a wife and a daughter, and that another version of himself from a different dimension, referred to as Rick Prime, killed them. This event is treated by the show as the true origin point for a huge portion of Rick's personality, explaining much of his coldness, his refusal to get emotionally attached to people, and his constant need to stay one step ahead of everyone around him. Rick spends years searching across countless dimensions trying to track down Rick Prime, eventually succeeding with help from a character known as Evil Morty. This storyline matters here because of what it reveals about scale. If one version of Rick was capable of essentially erasing another Rick's entire family and evading capture across countless dimensions for years, it shows that the ceiling for what a sufficiently motivated and sufficiently skilled Rick can accomplish goes far beyond what casual viewing of any single episode might suggest. The relationship between Rick and Evil Morty also deserves mention, since it shows another side of how far the show is willing to take its own internal power scale. Evil Morty, introduced early in the series and brought back as a major figure in later seasons, is eventually revealed to be running an enormous long-term plan aimed at escaping the entire system of alternate realities altogether. By the end of his major storyline, Evil Morty succeeds in cutting off access between the main collection of alternate dimensions and whatever exists beyond them, essentially sealing off an entire section of the multiverse from the rest of it. Rick, working alongside this character, and eventually being outmaneuvered by him at the end of that storyline, shows that even Rick, despite being called called the smartest man in the universe throughout the show, is not always the single most capable being in every situation. This detail is worth including here because it keeps the picture of Rick honest. He is extremely capable, but the show itself has shown situations where he is not automatically the most powerful character present. Rick's intelligence extends into areas beyond direct science and weapons as well. He has shown an ability to manipulate other characters, trick powerful organizations, and talk his way out of situations that should have ended badly for him through pure quick thinking rather than brute force or advanced technology. During his capture by the Galactic Federation, for example, he eventually escapes captivity and turns the situation against the organization that captured him, despite being held in a heavily secured facility built specifically to contain dangerous individuals. This shows that Rick's danger does not come only from what he can build, it also comes from how quickly he can think under pressure, and how willing he is to take enormous risks that a more cautious person would never attempt. Taken together, all of these individual pieces build toward a consistent picture. Rick Sanchez is shown across his own series as a scientist capable of building working portals between entire dimensions, creating self-sustaining universes from scratch, developing memory-altering and cloning technology, building personal weapons and defensive tools capable of handling direct combat, commanding an intelligent and heavily armed personal spacecraft, and successfully evading or outsmarting some of the most powerful organizations and individuals introduced across the entire show. He is feared and hunted by massive interplanetary governments. He is respected, and sometimes feared, by thousands of alternate versions of himself living in a hidden city built specifically to track and manage beings exactly like him. He has caused the end of entire miniature civilizations without much emotional reaction, and he has spent years hunting down the one person responsible for the worst tragedy of his life, eventually succeeding. None of this means Rick is treated by his own show as flawless or unbeatable in every situation. He loses fights, he gets outsmarted at times, including by Evil Morty in the storyline mentioned earlier. He struggles constantly with alcohol use and depression, and these struggles are shown affecting his judgment and his relationships throughout the series. But none of these personal struggles change the raw scientific and technological capability that the show has repeatedly demonstrated belongs to him. A flawed and struggling person can still be building devices capable of shaping entire universes, and Rick and Morty treats both of these ideas as true at the same time, without one canceling out the other. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This full picture of Rick's confirmed abilities sets up an obvious next question. Knowing what he has built and what he has done is only half of the picture. The other half involves exactly what tools he tends to actually bring with him into a fight. Which pieces of his enormous collection of inventions are realistic to expect him to use in a direct confrontation, and which pieces are more theoretical, built once for a specific situation and never seen again. That distinction between raw potential and practical battlefield equipment becomes the focus of the next part of this breakdown, and it changes the shape of this entire discussion once it gets laid out clearly. Section 3. Rick's Arsenal. Weapons, devices, and tech that matter in a fight. Knowing that Rick can build entire universes and outsmart massive governments is one thing. Knowing what he would actually carry into a real fight is something different, and this section focuses only on that second part. Building a pocket universe takes time, planning, and a specific goal in mind. A fight does not offer that kind of luxury. A fight needs tools that are fast, portable, and ready to use the moment things turn dangerous. This section goes through the equipment Rick has actually been shown using in combat situations across the series, separating the gear that shows up again and again from the one-time gadgets that only appeared for a single joke and were never brought back. The portal gun comes first, since it is the single piece of equipment Rick is rarely seen without. In a fight, this device does far more than simple travel. It gives Rick the ability to remove himself from danger the instant things go wrong, appearing somewhere else entirely before an attack even lands. It also gives him the ability to separate an opponent from their surroundings, sending part of an enemy through a portal while leaving the rest behind, or dropping an attacker into a completely different location mid-fight. Several episodes show Rick using the portal gun this way during dangerous encounters, treating it less like a travel device and more like a personal escape and separation tool that can be triggered instantly under pressure. Because it requires no charging time shown on screen and no complicated setup, it stands out as one of his most realistic and repeatable combat tools, rather than something that only works once under perfect conditions. Ray guns make up the next major category, and Rick is shown carrying some version of these in a huge number of episodes. These weapons vary in what they do, but many of them share a similar basic function, firing an energy blast capable of causing serious harm to a living target. Some versions of these weapons are shown vaporizing smaller creatures almost instantly. Others are shown causing burns or knocking a target back with enough force to end a fight in one hit. These weapons are treated by the show as fairly ordinary parts of Rick's daily equipment, something he grabs alongside his portal gun without much thought, the same way another person might grab their keys and wallet before leaving the house. This casual attitude toward carrying weapons capable of instantly ending a fight says a lot about how normal this level of firepower is within Rick's daily life. Beyond basic ray guns, Rick has built and used several weapons designed around size manipulation. A shrink ray appears multiple times throughout the series, capable of reducing a target down to a tiny fraction of their normal size. This has been used both as a joke and as a genuinely useful tool during dangerous situations, since a shrunk opponent becomes far easier to deal with, transport, or simply step on. On the opposite end, growth-based weapons and formulas also appear across different episodes, capable of increasing the size of a target dramatically. While this second category shows up less often specifically as a combat weapon, its existence adds another layer to the kinds of tools Rick has access to when a normal fight is not working in his favor. Freezing technology also appears repeatedly throughout the show. Rick has used freeze ray style weapons capable of stopping a target in place almost instantly, locking them in a solid block that removes them from a fight entirely without necessarily killing them. This type of weapon becomes especially useful in situations where Rick wants to neutralize a threat quickly without dealing with the mess or consequences of an outright kill. Freezing an opponent solves the immediate problem while leaving open the option to deal with them differently later, whether that means storing them somewhere, studying them, or simply walking away and leaving the frozen threat behind entirely. Defensive technology matters just as much as offensive weapons when looking at how Rick survives dangerous situations. Personal shielding devices appear across multiple seasons, capable of blocking incoming attacks that would otherwise be fatal to an unprotected person. These shields are sometimes built into other devices, sometimes worn separately, and sometimes generated by the ship itself to protect Rick and anyone traveling with him. This defensive layer explains a lot about why Rick survives so many situations that should have killed him several times over. He rarely walks into dangerous territory completely unprotected, even when his casual attitude on screen might suggest otherwise. Cloning technology deserves a second mention here, separate from how it was covered earlier because of how directly useful it becomes during actual combat and high-risk situations. Rick has created exact copies of himself and of other people, sometimes to take his place during a dangerous encounter while the real Rick escapes or works on a solution somewhere else. A clone can absorb an attack meant for the real target, buy critical time, or completely confuse an enemy who has no way of knowing which version they are actually dealing with. Very few characters across the entire series have shown any reliable way to tell a Rick clone apart from the original at a glance, which makes this one of the more quietly powerful tools in his collection, even though it rarely gets treated with the same dramatic weight as his bigger, flashier inventions. Rick's ship stands as a weapon system on its own, separate from the personal gear he carries on his body. The ship has been shown surviving direct combat encounters with other advanced spacecraft, absorbing damage that would destroy most other vehicles introduced across the show. It carries weapons capable of firing on other ships and on ground targets, giving Rick access to firepower far beyond anything a single handheld device could manage. In later seasons, the ship gains its own onboard personality and intelligence, adding a layer of independent decision-making that goes beyond simple remote-controlled machinery. A ship this advanced, capable of both taking damage and dealing it out at long range, changes the entire scale of what Rick can bring to a serious confrontation, if he has time to reach it and bring it into play. Explosive weapons and devices capable of large-scale destruction also show up throughout the series, separate from anything already mentioned. Rick has been shown building or accessing bombs powerful enough to destroy large structures, and, in some cases, entire smaller worlds or dimensions, depending on the specific device and situation involved. These weapons tend to appear during the show's larger, more dramatic storylines, rather than during smaller, personal conflicts, since using something this destructive tends to come with consequences the show is willing to explore rather than ignore. Still, their existence confirms that Rick has access to large-scale destructive power beyond his everyday ray guns and shields, ready to use in situations serious enough to call for it. Memory and mind-altering devices round out another major category worth mentioning here, since they offer a completely different kind of advantage compared to straightforward weapons. Rick has used technology capable of erasing specific memories from another person's mind, altering how someone perceives a recent event, or, in some cases, influencing thoughts and decisions directly. In a direct physical fight, this kind of technology technology might not seem as immediately useful as a ray gun or a shield, but in longer-term conflicts, especially ones involving deception, infiltration, or controlling how an enemy behaves without them realizing they are being controlled, this becomes an extremely dangerous tool. An opponent who does not remember losing a previous encounter, or who has been quietly influenced to make a bad decision, is at a serious disadvantage without ever realizing why. Robots and constructed helpers also deserve mention, since Rick has built multiple types of artificial workers and fighters throughout the series. Some of these are simple household tools built for basic tasks and jokes rather than combat. Others have been shown built specifically to fight, defend, or complete dangerous missions on Rick's behalf, reducing the personal risk he has to take on directly. This willingness to build disposable helpers rather than always relying on his own body in a fight reflects a broader pattern in how Rick approaches danger throughout the show. He would rather send something else into harm's way first, whether that is a clone, a robot, or a piece of equipment, and only step in personally once the situation truly requires it. A useful way to think about all of this equipment together is by sorting it into 3 separate groups based on how reliably each piece would actually show up in a fight. The first group includes items Rick is shown carrying and using constantly across many different episodes, such as the portal gun and basic ray guns. These represent his baseline equipment, the tools he almost always has access to no matter what situation he finds himself in. The second group includes items that appear repeatedly but less constantly, such as shrink rays, freeze weapons, shields, and cloning technology. These show up often enough to be considered a normal part of his available toolkit, even if they are not present in literally every single episode. The third group includes larger, rarer, and far more destructive devices, such as large-scale explosives or universe-altering technology, which tend to appear only during major storylines involving stakes serious enough to justify bringing them out. Understanding which category a piece of equipment falls into matters a great deal when trying to predict what Rick would realistically use in a specific confrontation, rather than assuming he would automatically reach for his most extreme possible option every single time. This distinction matters heavily for the rest of this discussion. It would be easy to point at Rick's most extreme feats, such as building an entire pocket universe, and assume that same kind of device would show up in any fight he gets pulled into. But the show itself does not support that assumption. Rick tends to match his response to the size of the problem in front of him. Small personal threats tend to get met with small personal weapons. Massive threats tend to get met with massive tools. But only after Rick has decided the situation truly calls for that level of response. This pattern will matter a great deal later in this discussion, once the actual threat level of the boys' universe gets laid out clearly and compared against what Rick would likely choose to bring with him. It is also worth noting that Rick's equipment tends to work best in situations where he has some amount of preparation time, even if that preparation only takes a few seconds. Grabbing a weapon off a shelf, adjusting a setting on the portal gun, or triggering a shield before an incoming attack all still require a small window of reaction time. In situations where Rick is caught completely off guard with zero warning, his equipment becomes far less useful simply because he has not had the chance to use it yet. This detail becomes especially important once the discussion shifts toward comparing Rick against opponents capable of moving and attacking at extremely high speeds, since speed differences can shrink or completely remove the reaction window Rick normally depends on. Taken as a full picture, Rick's practical combat arsenal looks very different from his theoretical scientific ceiling. His theoretical ceiling includes universe building and universe destroying technology. His practical, everyday arsenal includes ray guns, shrink and freeze weapons, personal shields, clones, an armed and armored ship, and occasional access to much larger explosive devices when a situation calls for that level of response. Both of these pictures are true at the same time, and both matter for different parts of this discussion. The theoretical ceiling shows what Rick is capable of building given enough time, motivation, and reason to go that far. The practical arsenal shows what he would most likely bring with him into an actual fight without extensive advance warning or preparation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With Rick's full toolkit laid out clearly, the next step in this discussion needs to shift completely toward the other side of this comparison. Everything covered so far has focused entirely on Rick and Morty's own universe, its own rules, and its own confirmed events. None of it means much without a clear and equally detailed look at exactly what Homelander and the wider boys' universe are capable of bringing to the table in return. That full picture, covering Homelander's real confirmed powers, his actual limits, and where his strength genuinely comes from, is exactly where this breakdown goes next. Section 4. Who is Homelander, the most dangerous Supe on Earth? Every piece of Homelander's power in The Boys traces back to a single source. His full name is John Gilman, though almost no one in the show ever calls him that. He was raised inside a Vought laboratory rather than by a family, treated from a very young age as a product being developed rather than a child being raised. This detail matters immediately because it separates Homelander from Rick in a fundamental way before any powers even get discussed. Rick built his own abilities through his own knowledge and effort. Homelander was built by other people, given his powers through a substance he had no say in receiving, and shaped from childhood into exactly what a corporation wanted him to become. Understanding this origin helps explain both where his strength comes from and why he behaves the way he does throughout the show. That substance is called Compound 5. It is a serum developed by a scientist working for Vought International, and it is the single source of every superpowered ability shown across the entire series. No character in The Boys is born with natural powers the way a comic book hero might be born as a mutant or bitten by something unusual. Every single Supe, which is the show's own term for a superpowered individual, gained their abilities because Compound V was administered to them, almost always as an infant. The amount given, the timing of when it was given, and sometimes even the emotional state of the person receiving it all appear to influence what kind of powers they end up with. This detail becomes important later, since it means power in this universe is not fixed or predictable the way it might be in a comic book origin story. It is closer to a chemical process, with results that can vary from person to person. Homelander received an extremely high dose of Compound V, higher than the vast majority of other Supes shown across the show. This is stated directly and treated as common knowledge within the story itself. The result of this high dose is a set of abilities that puts him clearly above almost every other superpowered character introduced across the series. His confirmed abilities include incredible physical strength, the power of flight, a level of durability that allows him to shrug off attacks that would kill or seriously injure an ordinary person, enhanced hearing capable of picking up conversations from a distance, a form of enhanced vision, and a signature ability where beams of intense heat fire directly from his eyes, capable of burning through solid material and causing massive damage to anything caught in the blast. Each of these abilities has been shown directly on screen multiple times, not simply described in dialogue and left unconfirmed. His strength has been demonstrated through feats such as crushing solid objects with his bare hands and overpowering other enhanced individuals in direct physical struggles. His durability has been shown through scenes where gunfire, explosions, and other forms of serious damage fail to put him down the way they would an ordinary person. His heat vision has been used to kill people almost instantly, cutting through targets with a level of precision and force that leaves no question about how lethal this specific power actually is. Flight is shown constantly throughout the series, used both for travel and as a way to escape or reposition during confrontations. Taken together, these are not vague or implied powers. They are demonstrated, repeated, and treated by the show as fully confirmed parts of who Homelander is. Beyond individual powers, the show has included direct statements from characters describing just how destructive Homelander could be if he ever fully let go. At one point, it is stated within the show that he is capable of leveling an entire city in a matter of minutes if he chose to use his full power without holding back. This is not framed as an exaggeration or a joke the way similar statements might be handled in a more comedic show. The Boys treats this kind of claim with total seriousness, and it lines up with the destructive capability already shown through his heat vision and strength in earlier scenes. A character capable of this level of damage, especially one shown repeatedly losing his temper and struggling to control his emotions, becomes one of the most dangerous individuals in the entire show, simply based on what he could do if his restraint fully broke down. Healing and recovery form another major part of Homelander's overall profile. Supes in this universe, especially more powerful ones, have shown an ability to recover from injuries that would be fatal to an ordinary human being. This includes surviving damage to internal organs and recovering from wounds over time that a normal person would have no chance of surviving at all. This recovery ability is tied directly back to Compound V itself, which appears to give the body a way to repair itself far beyond normal human limits. Homelander, given his especially high dose, benefits from this recovery ability more than almost anyone else shown in the series, making him extremely difficult to permanently take down through conventional injury alone. Despite all of this, Homelander is not treated by the show as a character with zero weaknesses. This distinction matters a great deal for a fair and accurate breakdown of his abilities. His physical body can still be seriously hurt under the right circumstances, even if it recovers afterward. Certain extreme situations have been shown pushing him close to his limits, including confrontations against other extremely powerful Supes who received similarly strong doses of Compound V during earlier, more dangerous versions of the serum, used decades before the modern version seen throughout most of the show. This detail matters because it proves Homelander is not automatically the most powerful being in every single situation the show has presented. He is the strongest active member of the Seven and widely treated as the most dangerous Supe operating in the present-day storyline. But the show has introduced other characters from Vought's history whose raw power comes close to matching his under specific circumstances. One of the clearest examples of this comes from a character named Soldier Boy, who was given an early version of Compound V decades before Homelander was created. This early version, sometimes referred to using a different name within the show to distinguish it from the modern formula, produced Supes with power levels that rival, or in some cases exceed, what current-era Compound V typically produces. Soldier Boy's power is treated seriously enough within the show that another major character, Billy Butcher, states directly that killing someone with that level of strength and durability would essentially require something on the scale of a massive nuclear weapon, the kind capable of destroying an entire city on its own. This statement is not thrown out casually. It reflects how seriously the show wants its audience to understand exactly how dangerous these top-tier Supes really are, and it places Homelander in direct company with a very small handful of characters who share that same extreme tier of power. Homelander's psychological state deserves attention here as well, since it directly affects how his powers get used throughout the show. He was raised without any real parental figures, taught from a young age that he was superior to everyone around him, and shaped by Vought executives who treated him as a product rather than a person with real emotional needs. This upbringing left him with a deep and persistent need for public approval and admiration, alongside a barely controlled temper that occasionally breaks through his public-friendly persona in violent and unpredictable ways. Multiple times throughout the show, his emotional state directly influences how much restraint he shows in a given moment. A calm, controlled Homelander tends to hold back and rely on his public image. A stressed, humiliated, or provoked Homelander tends to become far more willing to use lethal force without hesitation, sometimes in front of witnesses he would normally be careful around. This emotional volatility becomes one of the most important details in understanding how Homelander actually behaves during high-pressure situations, separate from simply listing his raw abilities. He has killed people in public out of pure anger during moments when his control slipped, including situations where doing so created major consequences for how the public perceives him afterward. This shows that his behavior is not purely calculated or strategic at all times. Personal insults, threats to his position, or challenges to his authority can trigger immediate and extreme reactions that go far beyond what a careful, image-conscious leader would normally allow himself to do in public. Anyone attempting to predict how Homelander would respond to an outside threat needs to account for this instability, rather than assuming he would always act with perfect, calm control. Homelander's role within Vought also shapes what resources back him up beyond his personal abilities. As the leader of the Seven and the most recognizable face of the entire company, he has access to massive financial backing, media influence capable of shaping public opinion in his favor, and connections throughout government and military circles built over years of Vought's corporate influence. This means that a direct confrontation with Homelander rarely stays limited to just his personal physical abilities. It often comes wrapped in layers of corporate protection, public relations control, and political influence that a purely physical fighter would not normally have access to. This detail becomes especially important when thinking about how an outside threat, especially one from outside the normal rules of Homelander's own world, would actually be received once news of that threat reached the public and reached Vought's leadership. It is also worth mentioning that Compound V itself carries risk even for those it empowers. The show has established that certain versions of the serum, particularly older or unstable versions, carried serious side effects and even caused death in some of its earliest test subjects, decades before the modern formula was refined. While the version currently coursing through Homelander's body is stable and has clearly worked exactly as intended for his entire life, this detail reinforces the idea that Compound V is not a perfect, risk-free source of power. It carries a long history within the show's own story of instability, failure, and consequences, even though Homelander himself represents one of its most successful and dangerous results. Homelander's overall standing within the boys' universe can be summarized clearly at this point. He is confirmed as the most powerful, active member of the Seven, and widely treated throughout the show as the single most dangerous Supe currently operating in the modern era of the story. His abilities include enormous strength, flight, heat vision capable of killing almost instantly, extreme durability, and a recovery ability well beyond normal human limits. Statements within the show place his destructive potential at a scale capable of leveling an entire city if fully unleashed. His only real rivals in raw power come from a small handful of older, more unstable Supes tied to earlier decades of Vought's history, with Soldier Boy standing as the clearest example of someone whose power comes close to matching his own. Backing all of this raw ability is a deeply unstable personality shaped by a childhood spent as a corporate product rather than a real person, alongside the full financial, political, and media resources of one of the most powerful corporations in his entire world. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This full picture of Homelander gives a clear and grounded starting point for comparison, but it only covers one character. The boys' universe does not begin and end with Homelander alone, and treating him as the sole representative of what this world could throw at an outside threat would leave out several other extremely dangerous individuals the show has introduced across its run. The next part of this breakdown moves directly into that wider threat board, covering exactly who else in this universe could realistically factor into a confrontation of this scale, and just how dangerous the full roster of Vought's creations really becomes once every major player gets placed on the table together. Section 5. The rest of the threat board, Soldier Boy, Butcher, and Ryan Homelander, is the face most people picture when they think about the most dangerous person in the boys' universe. But focusing on him alone leaves out several other individuals the show has built into extremely serious threats in their own right. A full and fair breakdown of this universe needs to include the wider group of characters who could realistically factor into a confrontation of this scale, since none of them exist as background extras. Each one of these characters has been given real screen time, real demonstrated power, and real consequences tied to what they can do. This section covers the most important names outside of Homelander himself, starting with the one character the show has directly compared to a weapon capable of destroying an entire city. Soldier Boy stands as the clearest example of a Supe whose power rivals Homelander's own. He was created decades before Homelander, during an earlier era of Vought's history, using a version of Compound V that worked differently than the modern formula most Supes receive today. This older version, sometimes referred to within the show using a different name to separate it from the current formula, was only ever successfully given to a small handful of early test subjects. Most of the people who received this early version during initial testing did not survive it, including large numbers of American service members and Holocaust victims who were used in dangerous early trials decades before the modern, safer version was developed. Because of how deadly this early testing period was, Vought eventually discontinued the original formula entirely and moved toward a more stable version used for the vast majority of Supes shown throughout the rest of the series. The handful of people who did successfully receive this early formula turned out to be some of the most powerful Supes ever created. Soldier Boy is the most prominent example, still active in the modern storyline, but he was not the only person to receive this early version. Other individuals from that same era, including characters named Stormfront, Bombsight, Private Angel, and Torpedo, were also given this original formula and developed abilities on a similarly extreme level. This detail matters because it confirms that Homelander is not the only product of an unusually powerful version of Compound V. An entire small group of Supes from an earlier generation shares this same origin, and while most of them are dead or inactive by the time the current storyline takes place, their existence proves that Vought's history includes more than one character capable of reaching the top tier of power shown across the series. Soldier Boy's power level is confirmed directly through a statement made by Billy Butcher, one of the show's main characters and the leader of the group trying to bring down Vought and its Supes. Butcher states plainly that killing someone with Soldier Boy's level of strength and durability would essentially require something on the scale of a massive nuclear weapon, specifically comparing the level of force needed to the kind of hydrogen bomb capable of destroying an entire city. This is an extremely serious claim, and the show backs it up by showing Soldier Boy surviving encounters and taking damage that would have killed almost any other character introduced across the series. His durability alone places him in a very small group of characters whose survivability rivals or matches Homelander's own, and his raw strength has been shown capable of matching Homelander directly during physical confrontations between the two of them. Soldier Boy also carries an additional detail that separates him from most other Supes discussed so far. Because of the specific version of Compound 5 used to create him, his body reacted differently when a dangerous virus was later developed and used against Supes during a major storyline involving an attempt to strip away superpowers entirely. While many other Supes suffered serious serious effects from this virus, Soldier Boy experienced only brief and surface-level symptoms before recovering. This detail reinforces just how unusual and resistant his body is compared to Supe's created using the modern formula, adding yet another layer to why he is treated as one of the very few characters in this universe who genuinely belongs in the same conversation as Homelander when it comes to raw power and survivability. Billy Butcher himself deserves separate attention here, since his situation throughout the show is unlike almost anyone else on this list. For most of the series, Butcher operates as a regular human being with no superpowers at all, relying entirely on planning, weapons, and outside help to fight against Supe's far stronger than himself. This changes during a major storyline where Butcher is given a temporary version of Compound V, sometimes referred to within the show as Temp V, which grants him powers extremely similar to Homelander's own for a limited period of time. While using this temporary version, Butcher gains enhanced strength, durability, and other abilities that put him on a level far beyond a normal human, though this effect does not last permanently the way it does for Supes who receive the standard version of the serum as infants. Separate from Temp V, Butcher is also affected by long-term exposure to actual Compound V later in the story, though the show handles this very differently from how it treats other characters. Instead of gaining Homelander-style physical powers, Butcher's exposure to Compound V begins interacting with a serious illness he already has, eventually developing into an aggressive and unusual form of cancer that gains its own strange range of abilities as it spreads through his body. This is a very different kind of power from anything else on this list, since it stems from cancer rather than clean, controlled superpowers, and it comes with clear and serious health consequences for Butcher himself as his condition worsens over time. His situation shows that this universe does not treat Compound V as something that produces the exact same kind of result in every single person who comes into contact with it. Personality, health, timing, and even pre-existing conditions all appear to shape the outcome differently from person to person, and Butcher stands as one of the clearest examples of just how unpredictable those outcomes can be. Ryan represents a completely different category of threat within this universe, separate from anyone created directly through a lab or a controlled dose of Compound V. Ryan is Homelander's biological son, born to a woman named Becca who had previously been exposed to Compound V herself. Because of this, Ryan appears to have inherited Supe-level abilities naturally through his parents, rather than receiving the serum directly as an infant the way almost every other Supe in the show has. This detail is treated as a major and unusual development within the story, since natural, inherited superpowers passing from parent to child had not been previously established as something that could happen within this universe before Ryan's introduction. Ryan's confirmed abilities closely mirror his father's own powers, including enhanced strength and the same kind of destructive heat-based ability associated with Homelander. Because Ryan is a child for most of his appearances throughout the show, his full power level has not been tested anywhere near the same extreme situations Homelander himself has faced as an adult. Still, the show treats his existence as an enormously significant development, both because of what it means for Homelander personally as a father figure, and because of what it could mean for the future of this universe if a naturally born Supe with inherited power on this scale continues growing and developing over time. Ryan's presence adds a layer of unpredictability to any long-term discussion of threats within this world, since a character with this kind of raw potential, still young and still developing, represents a very different kind of danger compared to a fully grown and fully realized adult Supe. Kimiko stands out among the wider cast as another character worth including here, since her abilities and her role in the story shift significantly as the series continues. She was given Compound 5 as part of a program that also affected her brother Kenji, and her original abilities included enhanced strength and an extremely fast healing factor that allows her to recover from injuries far more quickly than an ordinary person. Later developments in the story show her gaining additional abilities tied to exposure to radiation, eventually developing powers similar to what Soldier Boy possesses, capable of releasing intense and dangerous energy from her own body. This evolution shows that some characters in this universe do not stay locked into a single fixed set of powers throughout the entire show. Circumstances, exposure, and specific events can shift and expand what a character is capable of well beyond where they originally started. Beyond these specific named individuals, the wider Boys universe includes an entire additional layer of threat tied directly to Vought as a corporation rather than to any single superpowered person. Vought has produced dozens of other Supes across its history, some appearing as members of the Seven at different points throughout the show, others working as lower high-profile heroes stationed in cities around the world, and still others created and used specifically for government and military purposes, rather than public superhero work. While most of these individual characters do not reach anywhere close to the power level of Homelander, Soldier Boy, or the other top-tier characters discussed here, their sheer numbers matter. A single, overwhelmingly powerful individual is a very different threat compared to an entire organization with the resources, the funding, and the ongoing production capability to create dozens, or potentially hundreds, of additional supes if a serious enough threat pushed them to escalate. This corporate layer becomes especially important once government and military involvement gets factored into the picture. Vought has been shown throughout the series, holding deep connections with government officials, military contracts, and political figures who either directly support the company's work or quietly look the other way in exchange for influence and financial benefit. This means that any serious outside threat to this universe would likely not remain a simple one-on-one confrontation between a single outsider and a single suit. It would almost certainly draw in Vought's corporate leadership, its public relations machine, its legal and political connections, and potentially even government military resources, depending on how the threat was perceived and how much danger it appeared to represent to the public. Taken together, the full threat board of the boys' universe looks far more layered than a single name like Homelander might suggest at first glance. At the very top sits Homelander himself, alongside a small handful of similarly powerful characters tied to Vought's early and unstable history, most notably Soldier Boy. Just below that top tier sit characters like Butcher and Kimiko, whose power levels shift and change based on specific circumstances rather than staying fixed from the moment they first appear. Below that sits Ryan, a character whose current abilities are already significant, but whose long-term potential remains one of the more unpredictable parts of this entire universe. And surrounding all of these individual characters sits the much larger structure of Vought itself, a corporation with the funding, the connections, and the ongoing capability to keep producing additional supes as long as its labs and its formula remain intact. This wider picture matters enormously for the rest of this discussion. Any comparison that focuses purely on Rick versus Homelander, treating it as a clean and isolated one-on-one fight, misses a huge part of what this universe would actually be capable of throwing back at an outside threat. A single scientist, no matter how capable, potentially facing not just the strongest active supe in the world, but also a small group of similarly extreme individuals tied to Vought's darkest history, an entire corporation with ongoing production capability, and whatever government and military resources get pulled in once the situation escalates, represents a very different and far more complicated scenario than a simple one-against-one showdown. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything up to this point has focused on biology, and on what a chemical serum can do inside a human body. Rick's world runs on a completely different kind of science. What happens when that science comes face to face with Compound V is exactly where this goes next. Section 6. Compound V meets Rick's science. Compound V is a serum created by a scientist working for Vought International, and it works by altering the biology of the person who receives it, almost always as an infant, producing abilities that range from person to person depending on the dose, the timing, and other factors the show has never fully explained. Nobody in the boys' universe outside of Vought's own inner circle appears to understand exactly how it works. Even the superheroes who received it as children generally have no idea what is actually happening inside their own bodies. Vought treats the formula as a closely guarded secret, something valuable enough to hide, restrict, and fight over whenever control of it becomes uncertain. This single detail sets the entire foundation for what this section is about to compare, since it means the most advanced piece of biological science in that entire universe is something nobody inside that world can fully explain. Rick Sanchez, on the other side of this comparison, has already been shown treating biology and genetics as tools he understands well enough to manipulate directly. His cloning technology is the clearest proof of this. Building an exact copy of a living person, complete with a working brain and memories close enough to pass as the original for extended stretches of time, requires a level of understanding in biology that goes far beyond simple mechanical engineering. His memory alteration devices require an equally deep understanding of how a brain stores and processes information, since they do not simply block a memory for a while, they change it directly, cleanly enough that nobody around the affected person notices anything happened at all. These are not one-time gadgets Rick built by accident. They are established, repeated parts of his confirmed skill set across multiple seasons of his own show. Placing these two pictures side by side leads to a fairly direct conclusion. Compound V represents the the ceiling of biological science within its own universe, a ceiling that the people living inside that world cannot fully explain or reproduce on their own. Rick's confirmed body of work already sits above that ceiling, based purely on what his own show has shown him accomplishing in the field of biology alone. This is reasoning built from confirmed facts in both shows, rather than something either show has stated directly, and that distinction matters. Neither show has ever put these two things in the same room. Nothing here claims Rick has specifically studied a serum like Compound V. The claim is narrower than that. Based on what each show has actually confirmed about its own science, a serum built using recognizable human biology would very likely not stay mysterious to Rick for long, given tools he has already built and used successfully in his own series. From that starting point, 3 separate directions open up, and each one deserves to be walked through on its own, instead of blended into a single, vague guess. The first direction is Rick simply studying Compound V out of pure curiosity, without any larger plan attached to it. This fits a pattern already established across his own show. Rick investigates unfamiliar science constantly, often for no reason beyond wanting to understand how something works. If a sample of Compound V ever ended up in front of him, treating it as an interesting biological puzzle worth picking apart would match behavior his own series has shown many times before. This direction requires the least amount of speculation, since it only asks whether Rick would find something like this interesting, and his own track record already answers that question clearly. The second direction is Rick attempting to recreate, improve, or build his own version of something like Compound V. This is a much bigger claim, and it needs to be treated with real caution. No episode of either show has ever confirmed Rick building a serum that grants Homelander-style abilities to a human being. This stays firmly in reasoning territory. What can be said honestly is that a character who has already built working cloning technology capable of producing a fully functioning duplicate human being has already solved biological problems that would likely be useful steps toward understanding and possibly improving something built from a similar kind of science. Whether Rick would actually bother going through the effort is a separate question, tied to motivation rather than raw capability, and that question gets its own full section later in this discussion rather than being answered here. The third direction is Rick simply dismissing Compound V as unimpressive compared to what he already has. This idea lines up closely with a pattern seen repeatedly across his own show. Rick has reacted with open boredom toward inventions, weapons, and abilities from other characters that would be treated as extraordinary almost anywhere else. A serum that produces strength, flight, and heat vision is genuinely dangerous within the boys' universe, but it does not reach the scale of building a working pocket universe or opening a doorway between separate dimensions. Based on how Rick treats lesser versions of things he has already surpassed in his own show, it is reasonable to expect him to view Compound 5 the same way, as a clever but limited piece of biology rather than something that impresses him on any real level. These 3 directions are not competing theories that cancel each other out. They can all be true at different moments, depending on Rick's mood, his motivation in a given situation, and how much time he has available. A curious Rick, with nothing urgent going on, might study a sample purely for fun. A busy or distracted Rick might glance at it, recognize it as beneath his own work, and move on without a second thought. A Rick with a genuine reason to build something similar, whether for a personal project or as a tool against a specific threat, might actually put in the work to replicate or improve on it. All 3 fit comfortably within behavior his own show has already established, and none of them require stretching his character past anything confirmed on screen. It helps here to look specifically at how Compound V produces its effects, since this detail shapes how each of the 3 directions would actually play out. The show has established that dose size affects the strength of the resulting powers, that timing during infancy appears to matter, and that even personality and emotional state seem to influence what kind of ability a person ends up developing. Hugh Campbell Sr., for example, developed the ability to turn intangible, an ability the show ties loosely to his own feelings of being ignored and isolated within his family. Zoe Newman developed different abilities than her mother, despite receiving a similar substance, tied to the fact that she was given it at a different age. This inconsistency is a real, confirmed part of how Compound V behaves within its own show, not something added here for extra drama. It means the serum does not follow a single fixed formula that always produces the same predictable result. It behaves more like a biological process, shaped by multiple unpredictable variables working together. This unpredictability actually strengthens the case that Rick would find Compound V approachable rather than overwhelming. A scientific process with fixed and perfectly understood rules might be harder to improve without extensive testing, since every result would already sit at a known and stable outcome. A process shaped by messy, inconsistent variables, the kind that even its own creators do not fully control, is closer to the kind of unsolved puzzle Rick tends to enjoy poking at across his own series. Unstable science with unclear rules and inconsistent outcomes is a common theme running through many of his own inventions and side projects, and Compound V, fitting that same pattern, makes it a much more natural target for his curiosity than a clean, fully understood formula would be. There is also a practical angle worth covering separately from curiosity and capability, and that involves scale of production. Vought manufactures Compound V industrially, distributing it worldwide and using it as the foundation for an entire business built around manufactured superheroes. Rick, working largely alone, or with occasional help from immediate family members, does not appear to be interested in building anything at that kind of commercial scale in his own show. His interest in new science tends to be personal and immediate, rather than something aimed at mass production or public distribution. Even in situations where Rick creates something with enormous potential value, he generally does not turn it into a business or attempt to distribute it widely. This detail matters because even in a scenario where Rick fully understands and even improves on Compound V's underlying science, nothing about his established character suggests he would try to recreate Vought's business model around it. He would more likely use whatever he learned for a specific personal purpose and move on, rather than attempting to compete with Vought as a manufacturer. Comparing the actual mechanics behind each side's version of power adds one more useful angle here. Compound V works through injection and biological change, meaning its effects are tied permanently to a person's body once administered, typically during infancy, and cannot easily be removed or reversed except through extreme circumstances the show has only rarely explored. Rick's technology tends to work differently, often relying on external devices, portals, and equipment that can be picked up, used, and set down again, rather than permanently altering the user's own body. This is a meaningful structural difference. A serum-based system ties power directly to biology in a way that is difficult to undo. A device-based system ties power to whatever tool happens to be in someone's hand at a given moment. Neither approach is automatically superior, but they represent genuinely different philosophies of how power gets created and maintained, and that difference would likely be one of the very first things Rick noticed and had an opinion about if he ever examined Compound 5 directly. Taken together, this section reaches a conclusion that stays honest about where confirmed fact ends and reasoning begins. Nothing in either show confirms Rick has ever encountered Compound V, studied it, or built anything similar to it. What can be said honestly, based entirely on confirmed events from each show, is that Compound V represents the outer edge of biological science within its own universe, a science that even the people who created it do not fully understand or control. Rick's own confirmed body of work in cloning and memory alteration already demonstrates an understanding of biology that goes further than anything shown among human characters in the boys' universe. Based on that gap, a serum built from human-level science would likely not remain mysterious to him for long, whether he chose to study it out of curiosity, attempt to build something similar, or simply write it off as unimpressive compared to what he already has. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This conclusion opens up a slightly different question that connects directly back to the earlier discussion of Homelander and Soldier Boy. Understanding the serum itself is one thing. Understanding whether Rick's science could actually stop, harm, or kill someone who has already been shaped by that serum is something else entirely. And it depends on exactly how much force it has actually taken to seriously hurt the strongest characters the boys' universe has ever produced. Section 7. What it actually takes to kill a top-tier Supe. Billy Butcher makes one of the most important statements in the entire show when he says that killing someone with Soldier Boy's level of strength and durability would take something close to a hydrogen bomb, the kind of weapon capable of wiping out a full city. This single line sets the actual bar for this section. Everything covered here is about turning that statement, and every other piece of confirmed evidence from the show, into a clear picture of exactly how much force it has taken to seriously hurt the strongest characters the boys' universe has ever produced. Starting with Homelander himself, the show has never shown him being killed. Every serious attempt made against him across the series has either failed outright or only managed to weaken or temporarily stop him rather than end his life. Gunfire has been used against him multiple times with no lasting effect. Explosions have failed to bring him down. At one point in the story, a plan is put together involving a hydrogen bomb strapped directly to his body. Based based on the belief that conventional weapons would not be enough to stop him if he ever needed to be taken down by force. The mere fact that a plan reaching for a weapon on that scale was considered necessary says everything about where Homelander sits in terms of how hard he is to kill using ordinary means. Soldier Boy provides the clearest direct comparison point, since Butcher's statement about him is the single most specific claim made anywhere in the show about the actual force needed to kill a top-tier Supe. This statement did not come out of nowhere. It follows scenes showing Soldier Boy surviving damage that would have ended almost any other character in the series without much trouble. His durability was tested directly during confrontations with other powerful characters, and he continued fighting through injuries that should have been fatal to anyone without his level of resistance. Butcher, someone who has spent years studying Supes specifically in order to find ways to kill them, is not the kind of character who throws out a comparison like a hydrogen bomb casually. His entire role in the show revolves around calculating exactly what it takes to bring these characters down, which makes his specific choice of comparison carry real weight rather than being empty exaggeration for effect. Soldier Boy also demonstrated an unusual resistance to a weapon specifically designed to strip Supes of their powers entirely. During a major storyline built around a virus created to remove Compound V abilities from anyone infected with it, most Supes who came into contact with this virus suffered serious and often fatal consequences. Soldier Boy, because of the specific and unstable early version of Compound V used to create him decades earlier, experienced only brief and surface-level symptoms before recovering fully. This detail matters here because it shows his resistance is not limited to just physical damage from weapons and fights. Even a biological weapon built specifically to counter Compound V itself struggled to seriously affect him the way it affected almost everyone else exposed to it. Kimiko offers a slightly different kind of evidence, since her healing ability has been shown recovering her from injuries that would be fatal to an ordinary person without much difficulty. Her fast recovery factor has allowed her to survive combat encounters, serious wounds, and physical punishment throughout the show that would have ended a normal human character permanently. While her raw destructive power does not reach the same scale as Homelander or Soldier Boy, her survivability adds another piece to the overall picture being built here. This universe has multiple characters who demonstrate extreme resistance to injury and death through very different, specific mechanisms, whether that comes from Homelander and Soldier Boy's raw durability or Kimiko's rapid healing. Ryan's situation adds a slightly different angle to this discussion, since his full limits have never actually been tested the way an adult characters have. Because he spends most of the show as a child, no one has pushed him into the kind of extreme combat situations that would reveal exactly how much damage he could take or how much force would be needed to seriously hurt him. What can be said honestly is that his confirmed abilities closely mirror Homelander's own, including the same kind of heat-based power. Without direct evidence showing his actual limits tested in combat, any claim about exactly how durable Ryan is compared to his father would move into pure speculation, and this section is staying away from that kind of guess. His inclusion here is limited to noting that he shares the same type of ability as Homelander, without assuming his durability automatically matches his father's simply because the ability looks similar on the surface. Butcher's own situation, while affected by Temp V, offers another useful comparison point, since it shows what happens when someone without a lifetime of exposure to Compound V suddenly gains Homelander-level abilities for a limited period. During this time, Butcher demonstrated strength and durability that let him go toe-to-toe with Homelander directly in physical confrontation, something that would have been completely impossible for him as an unpowered human character. This detail matters because it shows that raw durability at this tier is not exclusive to characters who received Compound V as infants and grew up with it shaping their entire body over decades. A fully grown adult given a strong enough dose was able to reach a comparable level of physical toughness, at least temporarily, which adds useful information about how quickly and how directly this kind of durability can appear once the right dose is introduced into a person's body. Putting all of this together, a fairly consistent picture starts to form about what it actually takes to seriously threaten a character at the very top of the boys' universe's power scale. Conventional human weapons, including guns and standard explosives, have been shown repeatedly failing against these top-tier characters. The show's own characters, specifically Butcher, have stated directly that stopping someone at Soldier Boy's level of power realistically requires something on the scale of a massive nuclear weapon. Homelander's own storyline included serious consideration of using a hydrogen bomb, specifically because nothing smaller was believed capable of guaranteeing his death. Even a virus engineered specifically to target and remove Compound V abilities struggled against the most resistant characters, factors, managing only mild and temporary effects rather than anything close to a guaranteed solution. This bar matters enormously once it gets placed next to everything covered earlier about Rick's practical arsenal. Basic ray guns, freeze weapons, and shrink rays, the tools that make up Rick's everyday equipment across most of his own show, sit far below the level of force the Boys universe has established as necessary to seriously threaten someone like Homelander or Soldier Boy. These tools work extremely well against enemies within Rick's own universe, many of whom do not share anything close to the extreme durability shown by top-tier Supes. Bringing that same everyday equipment into a confrontation against Homelander specifically would very likely produce the same result these tools have already produced against gunfire and explosions within the Boys universe itself, meaning very little lasting effect. This is exactly where Rick's larger-scale technology becomes relevant again, separate from his everyday combat gear. Earlier sections of this discussion covered confirmed events showing Rick building and using large-scale explosive devices, including weapons capable of destroying significant structures and, in certain storylines, entire smaller worlds or dimensions. If the actual bar for seriously threatening someone like Homelander sits somewhere around the destructive power of a hydrogen bomb, based directly on statements made within the Boys universe itself, then Rick's confirmed access to explosive technology operating at or above that same general scale becomes directly relevant to this comparison in a way his smaller personal weapons simply are not. It helps here to be precise about what kind of comparison is actually being made, since this is an area where it would be easy to overstate things without careful wording. Nothing in either show has ever directly tested Rick's technology against Homelander's body. What is being compared here is two separate pieces of confirmed information from each universe. The Boys universe has established, through direct character statements and through the outcomes of past attempts, that stopping its strongest characters requires force on the scale of a massive nuclear weapon. Rick and Morty has established, through confirmed events across multiple episodes, that Rick has personal access to explosive technology operating at a comparable destructive scale. Placing these two confirmed facts next to each other is a fair and reasonable comparison. Claiming with certainty that this would guarantee a specific outcome in an actual confrontation would go further than the evidence supports, and this section is staying within the boundaries of what the confirmed facts actually allow. There is another layer worth adding here, involving accuracy and control, separate from raw destructive power. A hydrogen bomb, in real-world terms and within the logic the Boys universe itself uses when referencing one, is not a precise or controlled weapon. It destroys a massive area indiscriminately, which is part of why the show treats using one against Homelander as such an extreme and difficult decision, since it would also mean accepting enormous destruction and loss of life beyond just the intended target. Rick's technology, based on what has been shown across his own series, tends to allow for more precise and controlled application of large-scale force compared to a single, massive, uncontrolled blast. Devices like his ray guns, his freezing technology, and even some of his larger destructive tools have generally been shown targeting specific individuals or specific structures rather than leveling everything in a wide surrounding area without distinction. If accurate, this would represent a meaningful practical advantage, since it suggests Rick's approach to serious force tends to come with more precision built in compared to the blunt, area-wide devastation the Boys universe treats as its own last resort option. This precision detail connects back to something covered earlier regarding Rick's portal gun as well. A weapon capable of instantly moving a target to a different location entirely offers a completely different kind of solution compared to trying to match or exceed an opponent's raw durability directly. Removing a threat from a fight by sending it somewhere else does not require overpowering that threat's defenses at all. It sidesteps the entire question of how much force is needed to physically damage someone like Homelander, since the goal shifts from destroying the target to simply relocating it somewhere it can no longer cause harm. This detail matters heavily for the next section of this discussion, since it opens up an entirely different category of solution that does not depend on matching raw destructive power at all. Bringing this section to a close, the picture that emerges from confirmed evidence in the Boys universe is fairly specific and fairly serious. Ordinary human weapons do not work against the show's top-tier characters. The show's own characters have directly stated that stopping someone at that level requires something on the scale of a weapon capable of destroying an entire city. Even biological countermeasures built specifically to strip these characters of their powers have shown only limited and inconsistent success success against the most resistant individuals. Rick's confirmed access to explosive technology operating at a comparable scale, combined with tools built for precision rather than blunt area destruction, places him in a position where his available technology genuinely lines up with the level of force this universe has established as necessary, rather than falling short of it the way ordinary weapons repeatedly have throughout the show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this settles the full question on its own, and it was never meant to. Matching raw destructive power to a stated threshold is only one piece of a much larger picture, and the next part of this breakdown needs to look specifically at Rick's portal technology and what it could mean for handling an opponent this dangerous without needing to match their durability at all. Section 8. Portals, dimensions, and the problem of fighting an outsider. Every weapon discussed so far in this breakdown works by trying to match or exceed an opponent's durability directly. Bombs, ray guns, and even the hydrogen bomb comparison from the last section all share the same basic approach, which is applying enough force to break through whatever defense the target has. This section looks at a completely different approach, one built entirely around Rick's portal technology, and asks a very different question. Instead of asking how much force it takes to hurt someone like Homelander, this section asks whether hurting him is even necessary at all, if a threat can simply be removed from the fight entirely. The portal gun's basic function has already been covered earlier in this discussion, but it helps to restate exactly what has been confirmed about it before applying it to this specific scenario. The device allows Rick to open a doorway to a different location, a different planet, or an entirely different dimension, and step through instantly. This has been shown used constantly throughout his own series, both for simple travel and, in a number of episodes, as a way to escape sudden danger or reposition instantly during combat. The show has also confirmed that portals can be opened around other people or objects, not just around Rick himself, meaning the device is not limited only to moving its user from one place to another. This second detail is the one that matters most for this section. If a portal can be opened around a target other than the person using the device, then the portal gun stops being purely a personal escape tool and becomes something closer to a way of removing an opponent from a fight entirely. Sending an attacker through a portal into a different location, a different planet, or a different dimension altogether does not require overpowering that attacker in any physical sense. It does not matter how strong, how fast, or how durable the target is if the goal is simply moving them somewhere else rather than damaging them directly. This is a fundamentally different kind of solution compared to everything covered in the previous section about explosive force and destructive power. It helps to be very precise here about what is actually confirmed versus what would require reasoning to apply directly to Homelander. Rick's own show has shown him using portals against other individuals during dangerous encounters, redirecting or separating threats using this exact method. What has never happened in either show is Rick specifically attempting this against a character with Homelander's specific abilities. This section stays honest about that gap while still working through what the confirmed rules of each show's own technology would suggest about how this kind of confrontation might play out. The first question worth asking involves whether anything about Homelander's abilities would actually let him resist or escape a portal being opened around him. Homelander's confirmed powers include strength, flight, durability, heat vision, and enhanced senses. None of these abilities, as shown across the boys' universe, involve any kind of resistance to being moved, teleported, or displaced by outside forces. The boys has never introduced any technology or ability within its own story that behaves anything like Rick's portal system, which means there is no confirmed precedent within that universe for how a character like Homelander would respond to it. This absence of any established counter or resistance is itself useful information. A power specifically designed to resist teleportation or dimensional displacement simply does not exist anywhere in the confirmed material from the boys, since that kind of threat has never been part of that show's own internal logic. This creates a very real gap in defense capability that goes beyond simple durability. Homelander's toughness allows him to survive gunfire, explosions, and physical trauma that would kill an ordinary person. But toughness in that sense applies to resisting damage, not to resisting displacement. These are two very different problems. A shield that blocks bullets does not automatically block someone from being physically relocated somewhere else entirely, since relocation does not depend on damaging the body at all. Nothing in the confirmed material from the boys suggests Homelander, or any other Supe introduced across the show, has ever needed to develop any kind of resistance to this specific type of threat, simply because nothing like it has ever appeared in that universe before. Speed becomes an important factor to address honestly here as well, since it represents the most realistic obstacle to this entire approach working smoothly. Homelander has been shown moving and flying at speeds far beyond a normal human being, and combat encounters throughout the show have often unfolded extremely quickly. If Rick needed extended time to aim, calibrate, or activate his portal gun, a fast-moving opponent closing distance quickly could realistically interrupt that process before it finished. This is a fair and important limitation to include here rather than ignore. The show has generally depicted Rick activating and using the portal gun quickly, often in a single fluid motion during moments of sudden danger, which suggests the device does not require lengthy setup time under normal circumstances. Still, against an opponent moving at the extreme speeds Homelander has demonstrated, even a fast activation could face a real challenge if Rick were caught completely off guard with no warning at all. This is exactly why earlier sections of this discussion placed such importance on reaction time and preparation. A Rick given even a small amount of warning, enough to draw and aim his portal gun before an opponent closes the distance, stands a reasonable chance of successfully removing that opponent from the fight using this method. A Rick caught with zero warning whatsoever faces a much harder version of this same problem. This distinction matters, and it will not be smoothed over or ignored here just because it complicates a clean answer. Beyond direct combat use, portal technology raises a second and completely different kind of question worth covering here, involving long-term containment rather than immediate removal from a fight. If an opponent were sent through a portal into a completely different dimension, the practical result would depend heavily on where exactly that portal led. Rick's own show has confirmed the existence of dimensions ranging from relatively normal alternate versions of Earth to bizarre, hostile, or even lethal environments unlike anything found in either universe. A portal leading to a hostile or uninhabitable dimension could realistically function as a much more permanent solution than a straightforward physical fight, removing a threat entirely without needing to match its raw physical power at all. This detail connects directly back to something covered in an earlier section regarding the Citadel of Ricks and the wider structure of the multiverse itself. The existence of a hidden, tightly controlled location built specifically to track, manage, and sometimes contain dangerous individuals shows that Rick's world already has established infrastructure built around exactly this kind of problem. A version of Rick capable of accessing or working alongside this structure would have more than just a single doorway to a random location. He would potentially have access to a location specifically built for containing dangerous individuals long-term, adding another layer to what portal-based solutions could realistically offer beyond a single emergency escape during a fight. It is worth pausing here to address something honestly rather than letting it slide by unmentioned. Everything covered in this section about using portals against Homelander specifically assumes he has no meaningful way to resist or counter this kind of attack, based on the fact that nothing like it has ever been shown or referenced anywhere in The Boys. This is a fair conclusion to draw from the confirmed material of that show, since the absence of any established defense against this type of threat is itself a real and meaningful piece of evidence. At the same time, this conclusion depends entirely on The Boys never having explored this kind of scenario, which is different from that show actively confirming Homelander has zero possible resistance to it under any circumstance. The honest position here is that current evidence points toward no established defense existing, while acknowledging that this is based on an absence of relevant material rather than a direct confirmed test. Ryan's situation gets a brief mention here as well, since his powers closely mirror his father's own. Nothing about his confirmed abilities suggests any resistance to displacement or teleportation either, for the same basic reason already covered regarding Homelander. Soldier Boy deserves the same honest treatment. Despite his extreme durability and his resistance to a virus specifically designed to strip Supes of their powers, nothing in his confirmed abilities relates to resisting teleportation or dimensional displacement in any way. His strength lies specifically in surviving damage and resisting biological changes to his body, not in resisting being physically relocated by outside means unrelated to his own power source. This section's overall picture stands in sharp contrast to the previous one covering raw destructive force. Matching a hydrogen bomb level of destructive power, as discussed earlier, represents an enormous and difficult standard to meet, one that pushes Rick's available technology right up against its practical limits. Removing an opponent from a fight entirely through portal use represents a completely different kind of challenge, one that does not depend on matching raw power at all. It depends instead on speed, timing, and whether Rick has even a small window of warning before an opponent closes in. Based on everything confirmed about how portals function in Rick's own show, and based on the complete absence of any established Boys universe defense against this specific kind of threat, portal-based removal stands out as a genuinely different and arguably more efficient solution compared to trying to outmuscle or outdestroy a character built specifically to survive massive amounts of direct damage. None of this changes or replaces anything covered in the previous sections about raw firepower. Both approaches remain valid pieces of the same larger picture, and a real confrontation would likely involve some combination of both rather than relying on just one method exclusively. What this section adds to the discussion is a reminder that raw power comparisons only tell part of the story. A character built specifically to survive massive amounts of direct damage can still be vulnerable to an entirely different category of threat that does not rely on damage at all. And Rick's own confirmed toolkit happens to include exactly that kind of option. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With both the destructive power angle and the portal-based removal angle now laid out clearly, the conversation reaches a turning point. Everything so far has focused entirely on whether Rick could realistically handle this kind of threat if he chose to. The next, and arguably more important question, is whether he ever would. Section 9. Would Rick even bother? Every section up to this point has focused on capability. This one focuses on something completely different, and in many ways, more important. None of the weapons, portals, or scientific knowledge covered so far matter at all if Rick has no reason to use any of it. This section looks specifically at Rick's confirmed personality, his established patterns of behavior across his own show, and what those patterns suggest about whether he would ever choose to get involved with a world full of strangers he has never met and has no personal connection to. Rick's attitude toward strangers and toward problems that do not directly affect him or his family has been shown consistently across the entire run of his series. He has encountered entire civilizations in danger, entire planets on the verge of destruction, and countless individuals facing serious threats. And in a large number of these situations, he has shown no interest in stepping in unless something forces his hand, or unless a member of his own family is personally involved. This is not a one-time character trait shown in a single episode. It appears again and again, forming one of the most consistent and clearly established parts of who Rick is throughout the show. The clearest and most direct piece of evidence for this comes from the miniverse storyline covered earlier in this discussion. Rick creates an entire pocket universe specifically to use as a power source, fully aware that living civilizations exist inside it. When that power source is no longer useful to him, he destroys it without hesitation, ending every life inside instantly. This is not framed by the show as an accident or a difficult decision weighed carefully beforehand. It happens quickly, with minimal reaction from Rick himself, treated as a practical solution to a problem rather than something requiring any moral consideration. This single event says more about Rick's baseline attitude towards strangers than almost anything else the show has ever put on screen. Entire populations, in his own confirmed actions, can be created and destroyed as a byproduct of solving an unrelated personal problem without this weighing on him in any lasting way shown afterward. This pattern extends into how Rick treats other characters and other worlds throughout many individual episodes. He frequently visits other planets, interacts with other species, and gets involved in conflicts across the galaxy, but his involvement is almost always driven by something he personally wants or needs, rather than a desire to help anyone out of pure concern for their well-being. When he does end up helping someone outside his immediate family, it often happens as a side effect of him pursuing something else entirely, or because Morty specifically pushes him into caring about a situation he would have otherwise ignored completely. Morty's presence in many storylines acts as one of the only reliable forces capable of pulling Rick toward decisions that benefit other people, since Rick's own instincts, left alone, tend to prioritize efficiency, personal interest, or simple convenience over anyone else's well-being. Rick's relationship with his own family provides an important contrast here, since it shows that his coldness towards strangers is not the same as being incapable of caring about anyone at all. Across the show, Rick has gone to extreme lengths to protect Morty, Beth, Summer, and even Jerry at various points, despite frequently treating Jerry with open contempt. He has rewritten realities, fought dangerous enemies, and taken enormous personal risks, specifically because someone in his immediate family was threatened. This shows that Rick's capacity for genuine concern exists and is real, but it is narrowly focused. It activates reliably for people he considers his own, and it activates far less reliably, if at all, for people outside that small circle. The backstory involving Rick Prime, covered earlier in this discussion, adds important context to understanding why Rick's circle of concern narrowed so sharply in the first place. The murder of his wife and daughter by another version of himself is treated by the show as the central wound shaping much of his adult personality. A person who loses everything through someone else's cruelty, and who spends years afterward isolated and hardened by that loss, becoming closed off toward forming new attachments outside of what remains of his family, fits a pattern the show has built carefully and consistently. This backstory does not excuse the genocide committed in the miniverse storyline, or any other harm Rick has caused throughout the series, but it does help explain why his concern for outsiders sits so much lower than his concern for the small number of people he still allows himself to care about. Applying all of this directly to the boys' universe produces a fairly clear picture. Everyone in that world, including Homelander, Butcher, Ryan, and every other character discussed throughout this breakdown, would be a complete stranger to Rick. None of them share any connection to his family. None of them have any history with him. Based on everything his own show has confirmed about how he treats situations involving strangers with no personal connection to him, there is no strong established reason within his character to expect him to seek this world out, get involved in its conflicts, or care one way or another about who wins or loses within it. This raises an important question about what kind of scenario would actually be needed to bring Rick and this universe into contact with each other at all. Based on patterns already established across his own show, the most realistic path involves accidental contact rather than deliberate intervention. Rick's portal gun has been shown malfunctioning, being used carelessly, or leading to unintended destinations on multiple occasions throughout the series. A scenario where Rick ends up in the boys' universe by accident, rather than through any planned decision to visit or interfere with it, fits his established behavior far better than a scenario built around him actively deciding to seek this world out for some larger purpose. Once inside this world, even by accident, Rick's typical priorities would likely take over quickly. Based on patterns shown repeatedly throughout his own show, his first instinct in an unfamiliar situation tends to focus on figuring out how to leave, how to get back to his own family, or how to solve whatever immediate problem exists in front of him, rather than getting drawn into a wider conflict involving people he has no connection to. If Homelander or another character within this universe directly threatened him personally, Rick's established pattern of protecting himself and reacting strongly to direct threats would very likely kick in immediately. But this would be a reaction to being personally endangered, not a decision to intervene in the boys' universe's ongoing struggles out of any broader concern for that world's well-being. This distinction matters a great deal for how any realistic confrontation would likely unfold. A version of this scenario where Rick deliberately sets out to take down Homelander or dismantle Vought as some kind of mission does not match anything his own show has established about his priorities or his motivations. A version of this scenario where Rick ends up in this world by accident, gets confronted or threatened by someone within it, and responds with whatever force he considers necessary to protect himself and get back home, fits his established character far more naturally. The size and shape of the resulting conflict would depend heavily on how that initial contact happened and how seriously Rick perceived the threat directed at him personally. It is also worth considering how Rick tends to react specifically to being underestimated or disrespected, since this pattern shows up constantly throughout his own series and would very likely apply here as well. Characters who treat Rick as weak, unimportant, or easy to push around consistently receive some of his harshest and most extreme responses throughout the show. Homelander's own established personality, built around demanding respect and reacting violently to anything he perceives as a challenge to his authority, creates an interesting collision point here. Two characters who both react strongly and often disproportionately to being disrespected, placed in the same room together by accident, creates a realistic path towards serious conflict without requiring either character to have any larger plan or motivation beyond their own established personal triggers. Butcher's role in this hypothetical scenario deserves brief mention as well, since his entire character is built around identifying and exploiting weaknesses in dangerous Supes. If word of an outsider with unfamiliar and clearly dangerous technology reached Butcher specifically, his established pattern of treating any sufficiently powerful individual as a potential asset or a potential threat, depending entirely on how useful they could be to his own goals, suggests he would likely attempt to approach, study, or manipulate Rick, rather than immediately treating him as an enemy. This detail adds another layer of realistic complexity to how contact between these two worlds might actually unfold, since not every character within the boys' universe would necessarily respond to Rick's presence the same way Homelander likely would. Taken together, this section reaches a conclusion that stays consistent with everything confirmed about Rick's personality across his own show. He is not established as a character who seeks out strangers in need of saving. And the miniverse storyline stands as direct, confirmed proof that entire civilizations mean very little to him when they stop serving a purpose. His concern concern narrows sharply around his own family, shaped heavily by the loss he suffered at Rick Prime's hands. Any realistic path bringing him into contact with the boys' universe most likely involves accident rather than intention, and any resulting conflict would most likely stem from him reacting to a direct personal threat or a direct challenge to his ego, rather than him choosing to get involved in that world's problems out of any broader sense of responsibility or heroism. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This conclusion about motivation changes the shape of everything covered in earlier sections about raw power and available technology. Knowing what Rick could theoretically do only matters once a realistic reason for him to do it actually exists, and that reason looks very different from a simple hero stepping in to save the day. Section 10. The verdict. Weighing feats against motivation. Two completely separate questions have been running underneath this entire breakdown, and they need to be answered separately rather than blended into one vague conclusion. The first question is whether Rick Sanchez has the tools to seriously threaten the boys' universe. The second question is whether he would ever actually use them. Both questions have clear answers once everything confirmed across the previous 9 sections gets placed side by side. On the side of raw capability, Rick has been shown across his own series building working portals between separate dimensions, creating an entire self-sustaining pocket universe from scratch, developing cloning and memory-altering technology that requires a deep understanding of biology, and commanding an armed and armored ship advanced enough to survive direct combat with other spacecraft. He has been hunted by an interplanetary government powerful enough to hold influence across countless worlds, and he has been treated with caution even by an entire hidden city built from thousands of alternate versions of himself. His confirmed access to large-scale explosive technology places him in a range of destructive power that lines up directly with the same scale Billy Butcher used when describing what it would actually take to kill someone at Soldier Boy's level of durability. Beyond raw force, his portal technology offers a completely different kind of solution, one that does not depend on matching an opponent's toughness at all, since removing a target from a fight entirely sidesteps the need to overpower their body in the first place. Homelander stands as the most dangerous character within his own universe, backed by enormous strength, flight, heat vision capable of killing almost instantly, and a level of durability that has survived gunfire, explosions, and nearly everything short of a weapon operating at the scale of a nuclear bomb. He is not alone at the top of that power scale either. Soldier Boy shares a similar tier of durability and raw strength, tied to an older and more unstable version of Compound 5, and Butcher's own direct statement about needing something close to a hydrogen bomb to kill someone like him confirms exactly how seriously the show treats this level of resistance. Behind both of these individuals sits Vought as a corporation, with the financial power, political connections, and ongoing production capability to bring in additional resources if a serious enough threat ever appeared. Placed directly against each other, these two pictures suggest something closer than a simple mismatch. The boys' universe built its strongest characters to survive almost everything short of city-ending weapons, and Rick's confirmed arsenal happens to include exactly that kind of firepower, along with an entirely separate method of removing a threat that does not require matching durability at all. Based purely on capability, this is a far closer and more serious matchup than a quick glance at a cartoon scientist against a live-action superhero might suggest at first. Capability was never the full question this breakdown set out to answer. Rick has shown through his own confirmed actions that he treats the lives of entire civilizations as disposable the moment they stop serving a personal purpose. He has no established pattern of seeking out strangers in danger, and his concern for anyone outside his own immediate family has been shown narrowing sharply following the loss of his wife and daughter at the hands of another version of himself. Nothing in his own series supports the idea that he would choose, on his own, to seek out the boys' universe, take on Vought as some kind of mission, or position himself as an outside force working to save a world full of people he has never met. This is why the honest answer to the question behind this entire breakdown splits into two parts instead of collapsing into one. Could Rick Sanchez destroy the boys' universe? Based on his confirmed technology and his confirmed feats, the raw capability genuinely appears to be there. Would Rick Sanchez destroy the boys' universe? Based on everything his own show has confirmed about who he is, there is no real established reason to believe he ever would, unless something forced these two worlds into contact in the first place. The most realistic version of this scenario, built from everything covered across this breakdown, does not look like a planned invasion or a deliberate mission to take down down Vought. It looks like an accident. A portal opens somewhere it should not, Rick ends up somewhere he did not intend to go, and whatever happens next depends entirely on how the boys' universe reacts to him, rather than on any goal Rick brought with him. If Homelander responds to an unfamiliar outsider the way he has responded to challenges and disrespect throughout his own show, provoking him directly, the encounter shifts immediately from theory into the exact kind of personal threat that has reliably triggered Rick's most extreme responses across his own series. If Butcher gets word of him first, the encounter might look completely different, built around information gathering and calculation, rather than an immediate fight. What stays consistent across every version of this scenario is the size of the gap between what Rick could do and what he would ever choose to do without a personal reason forcing his hand. That gap is the real answer this breakdown keeps arriving at. The boys' universe is not safe from Rick Sanchez because it could somehow stand up to him. It is safe from him for a much simpler reason. He has never had any reason to look its way in the first place. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.